Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I am Captain Xavier, and today I'm going to be doing a complete disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Mega Centurion. Now, the Centurion has a very bad reputation of being an overly complicated blaster, an impossible blaster to mod. People are very scared to open it up. And while it is absolutely a more complicated blaster than your average magazine-fed Springer, it's not as complicated as, say, something like a Vortex blaster. And hopefully this video will alleviate some of the fear and bad reputation that this blaster has, and help you be able to get in there and be able to understand what's going on. Right, before I start the disassembly, I want to, of course, go over the controls so we can tell if it's working properly when I put it back together. You'll notice that when the bolt is forward, the trigger is unlocked, and so is the jam door. The priming indicators, which are right here, are currently blank. They will go green when the blaster is primed. When we bring the priming handle back, the jam door locks and the trigger locks. And then once we slide it forward, the priming indicators turn green. The jam door is still locked, but now the trigger is unlocked and we can fire it. When we do, the priming indicators go blank again, the jam door unlocks. If you have the jam door open when you prime the blaster, it will automatically close them. And if you have the trigger pulled when the blaster is not primed, it will in fact lock the slide. You cannot pull the slide while the trigger is pulled. So all a series of locks will go into. They're not actually that complicated or unusual for this style of blaster. What is unusual is the fact that when the blaster is not primed, the bolt is not forward. In every other magazine-fed manual Springer that I know of, that I can think of, when the priming handle is forward, the bolt is forward. They are directly linked. When you pull the priming handle back, the bolt goes back. When you bring the priming handle forward, the bolt goes forward. And so you cannot put a magazine in the blaster unless the bolt is back, unless they have the newer skinny pushers that we've started to see, which is a great innovation. But in this one, to put a magazine in, the bolt has to be forward and the blaster has to be unprimed. As we pull the bolt back, the breech closes. They are indirectly linked by a gear mechanism. And you notice that the travel of the bolt is much less than the travel of the priming rod, of our priming handle, and that is because it is a geared ratio that is giving you mechanical advantage. That's why it's such a light prime, despite being a relatively powerful blaster. You know, it's got to fire a mega dart through all of this barrel. And then once we fire it, the bolt closes, and that's giving it that distinctive ka-chunk, ka-chunk. The blaster is firing, and then the breech is opening in two movements. And that is interesting, and it's actually very similar to the mechanism of another blaster, but probably not the one that you're thinking. We will get into that when I actually show you how the mechanism works. So, let's get this thing apart. Now, as I say, it's not more complicated. We are going to need some additional tools than we usually use to open up blasters. We are going to need a standard Phillips head screwdriver. As long as it's small enough to fit into all of the screw ports, one screwdriver should work for the whole blaster. There might be some interesting spots on the inside that might need one a little bit longer. We will see. We are going to need some sort of a prying device to get the priming, the bolts off. They can be tricky. Sometimes they'll pop loose fairly easily. You may have to resort to a claw hammer, but I would recommend getting a plastic pry bar for a lot of Nerf work because it won't mar up the shell as bad. And finally, we are going to need a knife of some kind because there are 3 points that are solvent welded that we are going to need to cut loose and pop loose. So be prepared for that. We're going to start by taking the priming bars off so the thing will lie flat and be easier to work with. So we're going to use our crowbar. We're going to push in and under, and it should pop loose fairly easily. We can set those aside, get the other side. With luck, they will pop loose easily enough, and nothing should break, and they should pop back in easily enough. But now we can more easily work with the blaster. I'm going to start with the barrel. The barrel, when you acquire one of these new, the barrel was not attached. You had to attach it, but once it's attached, it's very thoroughly attached. It's very difficult to get the barrel off. You pretty much have to disassemble the blaster entirely to get the barrel off. But the blaster won't function without the barrel on. There is a lock that will prevent you from putting a magazine in the blaster unless you have the barrel on. I will show that lock and how it can be simply removed, and I actually recommend it. But we are going to start by disassembling the barrel section, and I will call out different length screws as we go. We're going to start here at the very front and work our way back. And we have our first length screw. It is a relatively long screw. It's the second longest screw that we're going to see, and we see that in both of these frontmost screw ports, and we don't see it anywhere else. So this is the only place that this length screw goes. The next ones that we are going to see are what I will refer to as short shell screws. We see them in a number of places in the shell, and we see them in a number of places internally. These are the ones that you're going to see in the rail. They are a little bit shorter than what we will see for most of the rest of the shell. Train! At this point, I'm going to start taking screws out of the main blaster, the main body of the blaster. We have another short shell screw here. And then we're going to start seeing what I will be referring to as standard shell screws. They are a little bit longer, but not a whole lot longer. So they're just a little bit longer than those first ones that we were seeing. I don't know if you can see that. In the upper corner here, as is very there's that train. As is very common with Nerf springers, we have an extremely long screw, and it's actually a lag screw. The thread doesn't go the whole length of it. Again, can you see that? It's the longest one we'll see, and we will see one more of those towards the back of the blaster. As I mentioned earlier, the 4 screws here in the rail are going to be our shorter shell screws. And here, on either side of this little wedge, just in front of the trigger well, we're going to see a, what are we up to? Fifth screw length. There we go. It's a little bit longer than our standard shell screws, and we're going to see those in 3 places. One here and here, and then again, one further back. In the bottom of the stock, we see our third medium length screw. And finally, in the back upper section, we have our second super long screw. And with the super long ones, be sure to apply plenty of pressure when removing it so you don't strip out those screw heads, because they tend to be a little harder to pull out. Okay, that should be all of our all but one screw. The final screw, you have to pry open the mag well. It's at the very end of this sling mount and is underneath this shell, but you can force the shell open enough to be able to access it. And this will give us a 7th screw size, or 6th screw size. It is a small screw. We will see more of those internally as well. So now we have to deal with those solvent welds. And the solvent welds are on the 3 sling mount points on the barrel. And so we should now be able to at least partially get the shell to open. And this is another time we're going to use our little pry bar to try to force things. And if we're lucky, the solvent welds aren't very strong. This one was super weak, popped right loose. We'll see if we're as lucky on the top. Doesn't look like it, so we are going to use our knife and just move it right between there. Pop loose that solvent weld. That will get us all the way to there. And then we're going to have to work our way backwards on this one. Starting in the front, we should be able to work it open a little bit. Well, it looks like we might be lucky on this front one too. Oh, we are. Cool. A little bit more. All right, I think that got all of it. All right, once we have all of the screws out and all of the solvent welds cut through, we should now be able to pry apart the shell. And we're going to want to be careful, and you're going to want to do this on a level area and a clean area, as there are a couple of things that are going to try to spring on you as soon as you get it open. Use our spudger to pop it loose. Now it's not going to want to open at first. You are going to need to prime it back a little bit in order to get some stuff on the inside to let go. But then we should be able to lift it off, and carefully. The one spring, the part that's going to want to run away, is this spring right here. It's part of the barrel retention system. It's the spring that holds the lock in place, or the catch in place, that holds your barrel in place. This is something, again, if you want to be able to remove the barrel, don't install that part. Just leave it out and its spring. We are going to start by taking a look at the other side, disassemble it, and get the barrel off of it. This barrel is fairly easy to remove. The only thing holding it in is a spring latch here, a little locking clip that locks in place. Push it down, pull forward. This will come off. The only other parts on this side are two screws that hold this side panel on that I don't feel like taking off because it's purely cosmetic. If you wanted to take it off, you could if you didn't want that on there. Some people don't. Set that aside. Take a look at the inside. We can take out our priming bar, which is geared and is simply placed in there. That will come out easily enough. On either end of the track that it runs in, there are some plates that cover it, kind of hold it in place when it's in certain positions. They are held in with that same tiny shell screw that we saw on that section of the barrel that was covered up. Swamp Cat says hello. All right. Same thing up front, two screws holding it in. There's really no reason to take these out, but we're going to fully disassemble it just for reasons. Same tiny screws. I am keeping the screws in the parts that they come out of so I know where they came from. If you want to make sure they don't wander, you can tape them in place. Next we have this fancy assembly. This is in fact our priming indicator as well as our slide lock. This is what locks the priming rod from moving when the blaster is primed, so you can't double prime and jam your blaster. It's got a pair of washer-headed screws, small ones, and a spring that is usually fairly captive. Yeah, it'll stay there fairly well. Put those and their screws together. And then we have a little spring retention plate, which is a nice little feature. Keeps that spring from wandering off. Put that with that. And that's everything off of this side of the shell. It's fairly straightforward. All right, now we can take a look at this side, which is where all the guts are. And we're going to start by taking this barrel off. Go ahead and take this rail lug out of here so we don't lose it. We are going to need to remove some screws so we can get to the other lock. So it has the same lock here, but then remember there was that barrel lug lock. There's another one on the underside that we're going to have to get to. So we're going to take out these 4 screws, which are all these smaller internal screws again, or small shell screws. Now we should be able to lift this whole barrel section out. And when we do, that locking lug will now slip free. It's got the same locking mechanism on the other side. We'll see it here in a second. We can go ahead and pull the muzzle out. And here is the other side of that locking mechanism with its tiny little spring. Be careful with that, it's easy to lose. And now we can push down on this locking mechanism and the barrel will slip free. Again, we're going to leave those 2 screws in because they're just holding the shell on. And now we are into the guts. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and we can start talking about this. I'm going to disassemble it from the front back and then we will reassemble it largely from the back forward. We're going to start with this part here. This is part of the dart gate assembly. This is what keeps the dart from being pushed down the barrel when it goes to chamber. We've got 2 pieces here. Keep their screw with them, though it is just a short shell screw. We're then going to take these 2 washer-headed screws off so that we can take this linkage. This is the part that opens and closes the dart gate as the blaster is primed. Set those screws aside. Couple of little springs to release. I'm going to leave this green gear on here, but I will go into what it does later on. Keep its springs with it. We don't want to lose anything. And then we are going to take off half of the magazine well. There are 3 shell screws. They are longer standard shell screws. And then this will come apart. We may have to bring the breech with it. There is a pin that will now come out. We then have this is the lock that prevents you from putting a magazine in the blaster when you don't have the barrel on. It's a part that can be left out. We'll talk about that when we go to put it back in. It has a pin that goes with it. We now can access the other spring-loaded barrel locking mechanism. Another one of those. We had one on the other side of the blaster. This is exactly the same part. Did I remove it from the other side? I didn't! I forgot to remove it from this side. So there is a similar spring-loaded part on this side that we will go ahead and remove now real quick. This is a part that you would be perfectly reasonable to simply leave out, but I will talk about it when we put it back together. Okay. We now have the magazine release assembly, which is held in by a couple of washer-headed screws. There are some tension springs involved. Make sure to keep all of that together. That'll all lift out. There is a pin that it all hinges on. We can now remove the other half of the magazine well. The other half of our magazine well out. Moving a little bit further back, we take out our jam door. And then we have this. This is one of the things that makes this blaster unique, and we will talk about it when we go to put it back in. It has a washer-headed screw holding it in place, as well as a torsion spring. We now have this whole assembly. This is our plunger, our bolt, and a gearbox. And this is what really drives this blaster. There are 2 shell screws holding the gearbox in. Standard shell screws. Now we should be able to lift this whole assembly out. Yes. We will need to disconnect the return spring, the bolt return spring, but we will leave it attached on the other end. This will come free, this will come out, and we can set those aside. We will talk about how all that works in a bit, of course. Part of our gearbox, a large pin for the gearbox. Okay, now we can start taking apart the trigger and catch and lock assembly back here. This washer-headed screw can be left in. It is just holding the trigger to the link bar, so it does not need to come out. Got 2 washer-headed screws here holding a lock in place. Keep all of them together. 2 standard shell screws holding this green plate, which is our catch retention plate. Take that apart. 2 washer-headed screws holding the trigger assembly in. Trigger assembly comes out. We can then also take out the catch. We can take out this, which is a trigger lock. We've got a trigger, or the trigger lock spring retention plate Very important part. Keep its screw with it. It's another small internal screw. Pull this out. This is another lock. We can now get our priming rod out. And then we have the same priming rod retention plates we had. This one up here, as far as I can tell, is identical on both sides. The front one is a little different. A longer one here, also held in with the same small internal screws. We have an issue here, which is a lock. And then finally we have our slide lock and priming indicator, which appears to have been broken. Interesting. I wonder if it was broken by me during this process, or if it was broken in assembly, or broken by a user. You never know. I will try to glue it and see if it will hold. And then the last little piece here, we have our spring retention plate and our rail locking nub. Okay, I'm going to attempt to glue this part in the hopes that it will hold, and then we will start reassembly. All right, now that we have everything out, we can start the reassembly. We are going to start with our priming rod, this part. And we want the one where when the teeth are pointing towards you, the area where the hole, where the handle goes through is further back. And that's going to go right into that channel, and you can tell it's in the right position if the hole lines up with the slot there that the priming rod is going to come, or the priming handles are going to come up in through. That goes there. Next, we have a pair of plates that go on either side that kind of guide that when the blaster is in one of two positions. We're going to start with the long one, this part. It's going to have two of these smaller internal screws that are going to hold it onto the posts here in the front. Train. Make sure that the priming rod goes under nicely. We're then going to install another one in the back. It's going to be one of these two plates. There are two of them, one on either side, and as far as I can tell, they are identical. Next, we're going to install this assembly, which is the slide lock and priming indicator. And if we have the slide all the way forward, it's going to go right here towards the back. There's a pair of posts that it will fit on. The green one will go on one, the orange one will go on another, and then there's a spot for the spring to go. It will be held in place with a pair of small washer-headed screws. And then we have this little part, which is a spring retention plate. It just goes on this little post right here and holds that spring in place, keeps it from wandering off on you. And now this part can go up and down, and it interacts with the slide so that when it goes all the way forward, it locks the slide. That prevents you from priming it when the blaster is primed. It also makes the little green indicator pop up when the blaster is primed, so you can tell if it's primed. Fairly straightforward. We then have these two parts, which is another lock that's going to go up here towards the front. Hopefully I didn't do these out of order and we can still get it on there. We can. The first one goes right there, and then this one with the tab is going to hook onto this spring that was pinned in place, and there really wasn't any way to take it off. Once you get it hooked on there, loop it around, it's going to go onto these two posts. There is a post on the back side that needs to go into that slanted slot there, and it will then be held in place by a pair of washer-headed screws. And this is yet another, I believe, a slide lock. So when this one's released and this one goes all the way forward, this will pick up and lock it this way if we haven't gone all the way back, or something hasn't come forward to disable this. We will see what that interacts with later, but it will lock the slide in the back position or in a partially back position if things are not properly in place. Next thing, while we're at it, we're going to come up here and install the barrel lock, one of those, which is one of these parts. We have a spring that's going to go into this little cavity up in the front, right up here. This is then going to come down over the post. You want the part to be slanting backwards so that the thing can come in and lock it. It's then held in place by a small washer-headed screw. Make sure it moves up and down relatively freely. Next, we're going to be installing a series of locks, and part of the catch and trigger assembly. Order of operations here is somewhat important, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see it a little bit better. The first part that we're going to install is this part. This is a lock. This prevents you from priming the blaster while the trigger is pulled. And it is going to go on this first tall post behind the trigger guard. There's a short post, it's going to go on this first tall post. The leaf spring is going to go underneath this little tab in the shell so that the natural position of this part is down. You don't want to install it so that that leaf spring is forward, which would force it up, because then it would always be locked and you would never be able to operate the blaster. So it needs to go below that so that the natural inclination is for it to be unlocked. The trigger will then lock it as you pull it. Next, we're going to install this piece. This is the trigger lock, and it's going to go on the third post back. And its spring has a little channel there that it goes into, you can see. Move that over a little bit more. A little bit of channel so it can hinge. And then we're going to install this little part on the post right underneath there, and this is another spring retention plate. Keeps that spring for that lock from coming loose. So that is our trigger lock. It will be disengaged when the priming rod is all the way forward and the blaster is properly primed, and will then unlock the trigger. Now, we need to install the gearbox and the plunger. So we're going to zoom back out a little bit, and we're going to take a look at the gearbox and how it works. It has one small screw that's holding it together. This is a unique screw. It is a smaller size screw, but it's a little bit longer than the other small internal screws that we've seen. And that will then allow us to take apart the rest of the gearbox. And inside, held on pins, we have a series of gears. We have one small metal gear, a slightly wider nylon gear, an even wider nylon gear, and then our doubled gear. This is the gear that does in fact connect to the priming rods and causes the whole thing to rotate when you pull back on the priming rod. It will cause this to rotate. So that is the order that your gears should be in. On the big gear, it is direction specific. So if you look closely at this picture, you can see there are notches in the gear, and there are tabs on this post that's connecting between them that ensures that you align them correctly so that they are properly aligned. So we're going to put the gearbox back together. We're going to put our tiny screw back in, and we are going to put our gears back together as soon as we can find that alignment point. There we go. If they're aligned correctly, they will go all the way in. If you have it rotated so that it's not aligned, the one side will not be all the way flush. So just rotate it until it lines all the way up. There we go. The next part that we're going to install into this is going to be this part. And this is the linkage between our gearbox and our plunger assembly. We're going to install it so that the teeth are pointing down and the pointed edge is pointed forward, and it goes into a slot here on the back, and it will cause the gears to spin, or rather the gears spinning will cause it to move back and forward. And that is how the prime works. When the priming rod with its teeth slide along the top of this, it forces this forward, which is going to force our bolt forward, which is what's going to prime the blaster. And then when you prime it forward, it comes back and resettles and unlocks a number of things. There are some control surfaces on this that are going to unlock things like our trigger, the slide, or it locks the slide, locks the trigger, things like that. And we will need to make sure that this is in the proper alignment when we install it, but we'll get to that in a minute. We're going to talk about how the plunger assembly fits on here. It has a tab here that's going to fit into this socket on the top here. It's going to fit right on there. And now when the gears go forward, that moves. So this is pushed forward by our gearbox. And it's making a run for it. So we're going to set the gearbox aside now and take a look at our plunger tube assembly. And this is where this blaster gets its reputation for being difficult to mod. And they're not wrong. This thing is very thoroughly solvent welded together and makes it very difficult to put an upgraded spring in it, or to build any kind of a proper breech. The back end is all solvent welded, the midsection is solvent welded. There are some screws, but taking them out doesn't do you any good. And if you were to crack all of this free, you'd probably end up breaking stuff, and then this won't hold on securely. And this little tab here is the catch. This is the main catch that the trigger releases to fire the blaster. And if you were to compromise the structural integrity of this ring, that's probably not going to hold. So it's very difficult to get to the mainspring, and then the mainspring is very specific because this blaster is reverse plunger. The plunger rod goes forward when you prime the blaster, and then when you fire the blaster, the plunger tube moves forward and fires, and then the whole assembly slams back. And that's how it gets that. When you prime the blaster, the bolt comes forward. When you fire the blaster, it fires and then moves back. That's where you're getting that second ka-chunk. You've got ka-chunk from it firing, ka-chunk from it coming back. And when you get right down to it, the blaster that this is most similar to is actually the Stampede. The Stampede has it motorized. This gearbox that we have here is very similar to the gearbox in a Stampede, except the Stampede's is motorized. In the Stampede, this is forced forward until it gets all the way forward, and then once it's all the way forward, it automatically releases the plunger tube, and it fires the blaster, and then the whole thing resets, and the motor keeps going, and that's how it's fully auto. In this one, we will see that there is a second catch in this blaster that holds this forward until you pull the trigger, and then this slams forward when you pull the trigger because its catch is released. It then releases the catch on the whole assembly, allowing this spring to bring it all back. We'll see that a little bit better when we actually get it all installed. So, the next thing that we're going to install is going to be our gearbox. There is a heavy-duty pin that goes in this big ring here in front of the trigger assembly, and then this slides down on top of it, but we need to make sure that it is in the correct alignment. If you've ever done any blaster, worked on any blaster that has gears, a geared prime, you know that the gears have to be perfectly aligned when you put it together or things will not work. And in this case, it's fairly easy to tell. There is a notch on this bar that comes in and out when we have it in there correctly. You want that to be just sticking out. You don't want it any further in, you don't want it any further out, you want it just sticking out. And you want the priming rod to be all the way forward so that it's actually locked. And then you're going to slide this down onto that metal post. There's a couple of screw posts that it's going to sit down on. And once the gears actually align, it will sit down properly. It should be, when it's in this back position, disengaging the trigger lock, so you'll need to push this up so it'll slide down, and this should not be locked. We'll make sure that it's in there properly. And if we unlock the slide, we should be able to move it forward, move it back, and we should be good. It should then lock into place. This should be all the way back, as far back as this could possibly go. This should be as far forward as it could possibly go, and that's how we know that our gears are properly aligned. There are then two screws that will be holding it in place. They are standard shell screws. One's going to go in the furthest forward screw post, and the other is going to go on the screw post that is connected to the gearbox. These other two are actually shell screw posts, and that's where those slightly longer screws are coming in because they're going through the shell, through this plastic, and then into the shell on the far side. So they have to be a little longer to get enough purchase. So that is where all of that goes. Now we're going to install our plunger assembly. First thing we need to do is secure this return spring. There is a pair of tall posts here. It's going to go on the short post right in front of it. And we are going to use a washer-headed screw. And then remember, that T-shaped notch on the bottom there is going to come up and go into the slot in here. There is then a tab here that should be in a groove on the far side. And when this is pulled back by that return spring, it will disengage the priming indicator. So as you notice, the priming indicator is currently not down, and that is in fact because the blaster is not currently primed, which also means that our slide is currently unlocked. So we can rotate this gear and the whole assembly will move forward as it should. And that's how you can test and make sure that everything is proper. If you rotate it forward, your trigger lock should disengage. When you rotate it back, the trigger lock should engage, and it is. So we have that properly aligned. Next, we're going to put in our catch, but not the cover plate. We're only going to put in the catch, this little part. The tab should be pointing down, and it's going to go right there, and it is what interacts with this tab on the, there we go, this tab on the back of the plunger tube is going to get caught on this catch, and that is what primes the blaster. Sort of. There is a second catch that we will get into in a minute. Next, we're going to install this part, which is, of course, our trigger. Move this forward again. There are 3 posts sticking up, 3 slots. It's going to go onto those. Lock into place. It should currently be locked because the blaster is not primed, so the trigger lock is engaged. It's going to be held in place with 2 washer-headed screws, and it's going to go on the back too. The front one is a little bit taller, and it's not going to be going on that one. That is indeed another shell post. So we're going to secure our trigger. We can then install the trigger spring, trigger return spring, now that it's not likely to pop up and sproing. And then finally, we are going to install our catch retention plate, the green part. It's got a little tab, a little post down here towards the bottom. We're going to hook that onto the catch spring, pull it all up and forward so it hooks onto those posts, and secure it with a pair of standard length shell screws. Make sure our catch moves properly. It does. Trigger should currently be unlocked, right, because the bolt is back. So the trigger is unlocked, and you'll notice when we pull the trigger, this lock, front lock, comes up and locks the slide. You can see it coming up there and locking into that notch and locking the slide. All right, we have one last lock to install, and it's this part. And it's going to go onto the 2 posts on our catch retention plate. The slot is going to go over the top of both of them. We're going to use one of our washer-headed screws to secure it to using the shorter of the 2 posts. So it can now slide, as you can see here. We're then going to install the tiny spring that goes onto it. The spring is going to go onto the post here, and we're going to secure it with our washer-headed screw, and then we're going to hook it to the little tab that's on there. And what this is an additional lock on the catch, which prevents the catch from slipping when the blaster is not fully primed. It also prevents you from being able to pull the trigger. So when this is forward, it's another lock in place to prevent the catch from slipping. And then when everything comes all the way back, it unlocks the catch, the trigger is unlocked, and we can pull the trigger and release the catch. We are now going to move on to what, in my opinion, is what makes this blaster so interesting and unique. We're going to install the second catch. We have the catch back here that holds the plunger tube back until you pull the trigger to fire it, but something has to be holding the bolt forward. And that is this second catch, and it is this part. And it's going to be installed on this post right in front of the barrel here. But first we need to install the torsion spring that is the catch spring. And this is a little bit tricky to install, but this is the proper orientation. There is a section that has a little hook, and then there's another pin that is straight up. We want the hook going kind of up into a 45-degree angle on the post. It should be in roughly this orientation. So currently, the part that's sticking up from the coil is down here. We want it to hook on this tab on our catch so that that spring is pulling the catch downward. And to do that, we're going to need to hook it with our thumb, rotate it up, and then push this down into place. And if it works correctly, we can then secure it with a washer-headed screw, which is also tricky to install. You're going to have to get the screw in place and then come from the top with your screwdriver and secure that catch. So the catch wants to go down. That is the key. All right, and now we can vaguely take a look at the action of this blaster. Hopefully it'll all be in frame. When we prime the blaster and this gear rotates, it's going to bring the whole assembly forward, but the plunger tube is going to catch on the rear catch. And so it can't go forward anymore. But the bolt can, and that's what is now compressing our spring and priming our blaster. And I can't quite demonstrate it without the shell in place because things will break. But this is going to go all the way forward until it catches on this catch. And that is where you see the bolt coming forward when you prime the blaster handle back. As it comes back, the bolt comes forward. It then stays forward because it's caught on this catch. When you then pull the trigger, it releases the plunger tube, which slams all the way forward. We can find a way to demonstrate that. I don't know that we can because it's not currently unlocked. There we go. This comes forward. The blaster fires, the plunger tube slams forward, and it disengages this front catch. It pushes that catch up, releases the bolt, and then this return spring slams the whole thing back. So the plunger tube going forward and firing the dart is the first ka-chunk. The return spring slamming the whole assembly back is our second ka-chunk. And that is why I say this is similar to a Stampede in its fundamental mechanism, because the Stampede also has a gearbox that forces the bolt forward. But on the Stampede, it's the bolt and the plunger tube that go forward, and the plunger itself is caught. And when the plunger tube gets all the way forward, it automatically releases the plunger and it slams forward, and then a return spring brings it all back. In this case, because this is a primed blaster and it doesn't go off until you fire it, the bolt goes forward and locks until you pull the trigger, and then this slams forward, and then it all slams back. So it's basically a bolt action Stampede, which is a fascinating mechanism. There are some interesting applications for a self-returning bolt. One of them would be a magazine-fed hammer-primed blaster, where when you pulled the hammer, the bolt moved forward, and then when you fired it, the bolts automatically opened back up again. And that way you would actually be able to chamber a dart. So, interesting potential applications. I don't know of any other blasters that have this, but the closest thing is the Stampede, which I did not expect. All right, let's move a little bit further forward. We're going to work on the magazine well and the dart gate, the breech area. So the first thing we're going to reinstall is going to be the 1/2 of our magazine well, which is simply going to slide in there. It's not currently held in by any screws. It simply slots right on there. Next, we are going to install the lock, as it were, the security lock that prevents you from being able to use this blaster without the barrel installed, which is a weird thing to have, in my opinion. There's no safety concern, there's no performance concern. I don't know why they designed this blaster so it has to have that long barrel. But here is the lock that does that. Do feel free to leave it out if you see fit, if you want to be able to run this without the barrel attached and don't just want to have to tape this closed. So we have a pin that goes on this red post that's sticking up in our magazine well. We then have this part which has a leaf spring, and again, getting the leaf spring in the right position is the tricky part. There is 2 hooked sections. I don't know how well that's going to show up. One that's coming up from the coil and then hooked, and one that's coming out from the coil and then hooking. We want the one that's coming out from the coil and hooking down, pointed down towards the bottom of the blaster. We are then going to install this part. There is a little tab that's going to be sticking down, but we need to hook that catch spring as we put it on. There's a little notch that the spring will lock into. It should look vaguely like this. And now, if the barrel is not installed and this is not pushed down, there is this tab sticking into our magwell that will prevent us from putting in a magazine if the barrel's not attached. Again, unnecessary. Feel free to leave that out. Train? All right, up next we're going to be installing 3 parts kind of all at once because it's the easiest way to get them all in. We're going to be installing these 2 parts, which is the muzzle and the breech, and they go together so that the section of the breech with a tab on it, there we go, tab on it, lines up with the gap in the breech there. We then have the other half of our magazine well, which has the dart gate connected to these 2 small gears. So making these gears rotate is what opens or closes the dart gate. And the reason we're installing this all together is because the dart gate needs to fit into the slot on our breech, and then the whole thing is going to kind of come in down together. There's a pin you've got to line up. There's a bunch of screw posts you got to all get lined up, but it should all socket in fairly straightforward. We then want the breech to be closed, so rotate the gears so that the breech is all the way up. There are 2 screws. These are small shell screws that hold our muzzle in place. And then there are 3 screws that go into the magazine. Well, let me just double check what size they were in case you didn't keep them in. They are standard shell screws. So 3 standard shell screws to hold our magazine well together. Next, we are going to install, it's sort of a lock. It's these 2 parts. You got this part with a spring and this part which is the retention plate that holds it in place. The retention plate has a socket there. One side is open, the other side has a little plate. The open side is going to slide over the section with the spring so that the side with the little plate on the back catches that spring. And then the whole thing is going to go in right up here. The screw holds it in place. And what this does is if this is to the right, it will lock the dart gate. So the dart gate cannot open. Once this gets pushed forward, then the gears can make the dart gate open and you'll actually be able to fire the blaster. So that's locking our dart gate closed. So obviously we need something to unlock it, and that is going to be this assembly. So it's this weird piece with the 2 springs and the little green gear, we are now going to install this. The little green gear is going to be installed as far to the right as possible in the little section that it will clearly fit in. And then the link itself will go on to the 2 screw posts, which we will then secure with some washer-headed screws. And finally, we are going to reconnect our little tension spring to its little tab. And this is the thing that both unlocks the dart gate and opens it. So as this moves forward, remember these gears are locked because of that piece, so the green gear can't move, but it's under tension, so it wants to move, but it can't. It then deactivates that part that's locking the dart gate, and once it goes far enough forward, it releases the dart gate, the green part moves forward, the gears unlock the dart gate, and the blaster is now ready to fire. And then once you go to prime the blaster again, this moves back, this moves forward, the gears bring the dart gate back up and lock it in place again. So that is opening and closing, locking and unlocking the dart gate so that the breech can, in fact, load a dart into it rather than just pushing the dart into the barrel. Up next we have the magazine catch and release, this series of parts. The part with the that actually locks the magazine in place is going to go onto these 2 posts here and here, and is held in place with a washer-headed screw. We then have the spring, which is going to hook onto the little tab and then go onto this screw post here and be secured with our other washer-headed screw. The lever on our pin, there is a wider section and a slightly narrower section. The narrower section goes up, the wider section goes down. It will only fit one way. And then finally, the button goes in. The section with the longer little plate is going to go up. It's going to go in under that lever, and that is your magazine release. The next part, jam door, also not truly necessary, but it goes there. It is actually locked in place when the bolt comes forward. There's a tab up here that locks the gate, the jam door closed. It's held in place by our secondary catch there. And the last part that's going to go on this side of the shell is going to be our rail retention nub up there. So we're now done with this side of the blaster, and we're going to switch to the other side. We've got a few things to install here, but nothing we didn't install on the other side, so it's very straightforward. We have one of these plates again, which again, as far as I know, it's identical to the other one, so it shouldn't matter which one you put on which side. Back here with 2 of our littlest shell screws. We then have this plate, which is going to go in the front. We have our barrel locking mechanism, this part. It's going to go right up here. The spring goes on a post that's deep down in there, and then this comes down over the top and gets held in place with a washer-headed screw. We can now install the other side of our slide. Again, the section with the hole for the priming handle is going to go towards the back. But we are going to slide it forward, all the way forward. And now we can install the slide lock and priming indicator, which goes on the 2 posts right there. Oh, here's something to keep an eye for. Make sure that the indicator part, which is kind of free floating, is in the right position. It needs to be up so that it actually goes upwards into that slot. If it falls in back here, which it can, it will in fact jam the blaster. And the blaster will not operate at all. And I suspect that's how the rod got broken on the previous one, is that they had that in the wrong position when they assembled the blaster and someone forced it. That's my guess anyway. I could be wrong, but that's my guess on what happened. But that should now move. We then have one of these little parts, our spring retention plate, and that is it for this side of the blaster. We are now ready to assemble the shells, and this is a somewhat complicated part. It took me a while to figure out how to do this smoothly. Where the issue comes in is we need the priming rod all the way forward. The problem is on this blaster, it knows that it's not primed, and so that slide is not caught. Even though it's all the way back, the priming indicator is down because the blaster is not primed. On this side, when the priming rod is all the way forward, the catch is engaged because we don't have the part that disengages the catch. So we're going to need to disengage the catch manually, slide this back just enough to not be engaged, which isn't much. And then we're going to flip it over, and we're going to slide this one back a little bit because it's not locked. We can slide it. So we're going to slide it back a little bit. Then we're going to put the shells together, starting in the front. But before we go too much further back, just to get the very front to kind of connect. Trying. Once we get the front aligned, we need to make sure that both priming rods are aligned. So you're going to have to look through the hole and make sure that it is lined up with the other priming rod. And you can check by using a screwdriver to make sure it'll go all the way through to both, and then it's good. Close the shell up a little bit, as far as it will. It won't close all the way. You're going to need to prime it back, and you'll hear some stuff clunk, and then you're going to prime it forward, and the shell will then lock into place. So you're going to prime it back, prime it forward, and everything should clunk into place. Once you get it to actually close, you can test it, use one of your priming rods. Don't actually lock it all the way in, bring it all the way back, bring it all the way forward. If it fires, okay, we're good. We can now button it up. None of the locks are improperly engaged, which is a serious problem. And we're now ready to reassemble the screws. So we're gonna start at the front. Remember, the little screw up here was one of our little shell screws. We then had 4 more little shell screws along the top rail. That is all of our little shell screws. We then have 3 longer shell screws. They're going to go on either side of where the gearbox is, in the 2 right in front of the trigger well. And the bottommost screw back here, bottommost post, in the very back lower section of the stock. We then have 2 extra long, and they're the ones that don't have thread all the way. They're going to go in the upper right or the upper left corner, as is very common with Nerf springers. There's a particularly long screw in that upper section. Remember to apply plenty of pressure because this is one that can get easily stripped out, because it's a very long, solid screw. Second long screw goes in the upper back section of the stock. Again, lots of pressure. You don't want to strip this screw out because it's not an easy one to replace. All of the rest of the screws are our standard shell screw length. Last step, we're going to reinstall our priming handles. And now, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. However, blaster will not currently function because we have that lock in the magazine because we don't have the barrel on. So we are going to need to reassemble the barrel. This is a little bit trickier than it really should be, assuming you actually want to put the locking mechanisms back in, which I'm going to demonstrate. I recommend not doing it. So you could actually take the barrel off if you wanted to. But if you want it to lock, you're going to take the locking lug. It's got a shorter section and a taller section. You want the taller section pointing away from you. You're going to take one of the locking lugs. It'll only fit in one way. There's a tab to ensure that it only fits in the one way. You're then going to take your tiny, tiny, very easy to lose little spring, balance it on there, and then you're going to take the side of the shell that doesn't have the screws, pointing to the muzzle pointing to your left, and you're going to bring it down on top in such a way that you can't really see, because it's the only way to install that locking lug with that spring, because I don't know why they designed it that way. It's weird. Once you have it on, we're going to secure it with a pair of our small shell screws on the front 2 holes. The other 2 are shell posts. One of those on either side. Once that is secure, so our screw cannot wander, we are going to reinstall the barrel, which as far as I can tell is omnidirectional. And then we can put our rail locking nub on, and then our other catch lock piece, our other tiny, easy to lose spring that's going to make a run for it, but we got it. And then we can put the other side of the shell on and get it to all... Oh, we missed our front side post. Very important. There we go. Okay. We have 3 screw sizes. We'll start with the little one, which goes back here on the sling mount. We then have 2 longer ones. They're going to go in the far front. And all the rest are small shell screws. And now your barrel is fully assembled. You can put it onto the front, lock it in place, and it's not coming back off unless you disassemble the whole thing. We will do a check of all of our controls. Trigger is locked when it's not primed. Jam door is open when it's not primed. Once the bolt is back, the jam door is locked. The breech is forward. The trigger is still locked. We come forward. Jam door is still locked because it's primed. When we fire, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. That should be everything. We cannot prime if the trigger is pulled, so that lock is working. We are good to go. So that is the big, bad, scary, nasty Centurion. As I said, it is a more complicated blaster. I'm not pretending it isn't, but it's not nearly as bad as I feel a lot of people make it out to be. So hopefully if you had disassembled yours and were desperately trying to figure out how it went back together, hopefully this will help. Survey for what you guys want to see next will be on my community tab. Feel free to vote. Feel free to comment suggestions either on there or on here for blasters that are the survey that you would like to see. And if I have them or I can get my hands on them, I'll add them to the survey and y'all can vote for it. And as always, thank you guys for watching.